Hi, this is the first of several lectures on the respiratory system. And the first section, 10.1, just gives you kind of the general overview of the respiratory system. And the function of the respiratory system is getting oxygen into the body and carbon dioxide out. If we were a single-celled organism, we wouldn't need a respiratory system because oxygen would just diffuse into the cell and carbon dioxide would diffuse out. But because we are a multicellular organism, we've got to get oxygen all the way to our toes. So we have our lungs to breathe in oxygen, and then our cardiovascular system to carry that oxygen to all of our cells. Remember, we talked about how oxygen is essential for us to metabolize our food. So carbon dioxide is a waste product of that metabolism. That also goes into our blood, so we can exhale that through our lungs. When you look at the structure of the respiratory system, generally people divide it into the upper and the lower respiratory tracts. And the upper respiratory tract has the nasal cavity. You have your sinuses up there. It says it filters and warms and moistens air. The pharynx, which is a fancy word for the throat. The glottis. So here, if air comes into your nasal cavity, it goes into your pharynx or your throat, and then it has to go down into the lungs. So there actually is a hole right here that's called the glottis, and that's the hole where the air can go down into the first structure, the larynx. So the larynx is actually the voice box. So the glottis is kind of an opening to that voice box where air can go. If we go to the lower respiratory tract, get me out of the way, the lower respiratory tract, that glottis hole goes to the larynx, and the larynx is continuous with the trachea. Now, it's kind of hard on yourself to figure out where's my larynx and where's my trachea, but feel right in the front, and you can feel a hard cartilaginous tube. Remember when we did digestion, we said the esophagus is behind the trachea. So you can't see it in this picture because the trachea is blocking it. But you can touch your trachea, but you can't touch your esophagus. And so when you're trying to figure out where your larynx is, if you're talking and touching it at the same time, I can kind of work my way up. Go, right there. My voice changed. I could tell that by touching there, I was affecting my voice, and that's where your larynx is. It's kind of high up. Now, men will have a little, typically will have a little bulge there, an enlargement that makes their voices deeper, just because it changes the size of that larynx. I can feel a little bit of an enlargement there, but that voice box is continuous with the trachea. So your air has to go through your voice box in order to get into your trachea. Notice as you're talking, you can't breathe in and out. You're kind of holding your breath, kind of breathing out only as you're talking because you're using that same tube. So in the lower respiratory tract, the first part of that is the trachea, and then the trachea is going to branch into some other tubes, and these again have cartilage rings to hold them open, and each is called a bronchus, or you might hear them called bronchi, and then they're branched into smaller bronchioles. Now these small bronchioles end up in little air sacs that we call alveoli, and they don't have them. Oh, here's some on this picture right here. So, and actually the fleshy part of the lungs are all just these alveoli. They are the air sacs that make up the lungs, and there's that gives you this like tremendous surface area of the lungs. And then finally we have the diaphragm, which is a muscle that the lungs sit on. So it actually cuts your whole torso. It goes all the way from the front to the back and side to side. And it's this big flat muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal pelvic cavity. And that's the muscle that contracts and relaxes and allows you to breathe. So let's see, just a couple vocabulary words. We had this word ventilation, which just means breathing. And ventilation has inspiration, which is the same thing as inhalation, inhaling, breathing in. And so the air comes in through your mouth and your nasal cavity, into your pharynx, down your down your larynx, through the glottis, down the larynx and the trachea, bronchioles in the lungs. And then you have expiration that reverses that. So inspiration plus expiration, also called exhalation, is together called ventilation. And remember, the main thing that we're trying to do is deliver oxygen to our cells so they can make ATP and get rid of carbon dioxide waste. Talks a little bit about homeostasis, which kind of is what I just said. I'm going to go into the section 10.2 and talk just a little bit more about the upper respiratory tract. Let's see what I didn't tell you so far. They give you a little bit more detail here than what we had in the previous picture, but one thing that you can see on this picture is when we talk about the pharynx or the throat, there's actually three major parts. And so there's the part of the throat that goes up into the nasal cavity. So I kind of remember one of the highlights of my childhood was my at the dinner table, my mother swallowing milk and then somebody making her laugh, and the milk was forced up into her nasal cavity and came out her nose. And we all know how kids love stuff like that. But there's a continuous pathway there. Fortunately, we have this uvula hanging down, this part of our soft palate that kind of blocks off the nasal cavity. And so under normal circumstances, your food does not head up in that direction. Let's see, what else do we have? We have the oral pharynx is what the part when you look in the mirror and you can see your throat, and then the laryngeal pharynx. So your throat kind of goes down also, like where your food's going to go, and air. So the pharynx is actually not just the part of your throat that you see. The other thing that we talk about, particularly in lab, is here we have the glottis, which is the opening, the hole where air is going to go into the larynx and into the trachea. But you really want to make sure food and water don't go down into the larynx and the trachea. So here you're going to swallow, and food has to pass back here to the esophagus, and air has to pass more anteriorly into the trachea. And so what helps you figure that out is when you swallow, the trachea and your larynx kind of move up. And there's a video of this in the lab. And what happens is this glottis gets covered with this little piece of cartilage called the epiglottis. And so when you're swallowing, this epiglottis is going to cover the glottis, and your food is going to pass to the esophagus instead of the trachea. And you can feel that if you put your fingers on your trachea and swallow. I feel my fingers moving up, and that's your trachea moving up and being covered up by the epiglottis. Let's see, it talks a little bit about the nose. I think I did the pharynx. Here's a review of the Heimlich maneuver. That's always good to get a little review of that. You're going to push up on the diaphragm to force a trapped object out of the trachea. So pushing up is critical for that. The larynx contains the vocal cords, and this is an actual picture of someone's throat versus a diagram. But yeah, the vocal cords are, when they're contracted, which we do when we're making sound, the air will move past them and vibrate them and make sounds. So the larynx is the voice box and the pharynx is the throat. I don't know why they made them sound so similar. Here it talks a little bit about the epiglottis, which I already did. So I'm going to stop right there.